My name is Cynthia Cox, and this is my informative speech. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce my audience.
Christine West, Ann Walker,
Hi, Debbie Scott.
Sarah Abramovitz.
Hi, Stephanie Ralph.
And Terica Bryant.
Many of us are familiar with the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II. But have you ever wondered why, following the war, so many Nazis were unable to accept any personal responsibility for the crimes they committed, and why so many of them sought to justify their actions? Inspired by the Nuremberg trials and the "I was just following orders" defense of the Nazis, Stanley Milgram set out in 1961 to investigate the psychology behind these ideas. The purpose of the Milgram experiment was to investigate obedience to authority, to observe the struggle between following authority and following one's conscience, and to determine whether we as human beings are just wired to be obedient. According to Sal McCloud, Milgram wanted to research how far people would go in following orders, even if that meant that you would be harming someone else. Milgram's main focus was on the ability to obey authority, even if that meant that it was in direct conflict with your conscience. He wondered what circumstances a person would have to be in order to do that. Now that we've discussed the purpose of the experiment, I'd like to go into some detail about how the experiment was carried out. The experiment was conducted at Yale University. There were participants that replied to a newspaper article, and the participants were originally told, according to Jan DeVos, that it was an experiment on learning and punishment. There were 3 roles that needed to be filled for the experiment: teacher, learner, and experimenter. The experimenter was an actor, and he was just fulfilling the role of the person overseeing the experiment, or the authority figure. The participants were unknowingly paired with another actor. They drew straws to determine who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. But the drawing was rigged so that the actor was always the learner. The learner was placed in a separate room and strapped to a chair with electrodes attached. The experimenter and the teacher were placed in a separate room. The teacher was in charge of controlling the electric shock generator. And the electric shock generator ranged from 15 volts, which was considered a slight shock, to 450 volts, which was labeled severe danger. The learner was asked to memorize a list of word pairs, and the teacher would then ask the learner the teacher would then state a word and ask the learner to recall the word's pair. If the learner was unable to recall the word, then a shock would be administered. With each subsequent wrong answer, which the learner would do on purpose, the intensity of the shocks was increased. At certain times during the experiment, the teacher was able to hear the learner screaming out in pain, and at some points even asking for the experiment to be stopped. If the teacher showed any hesitation to administer the next volt, the experimenter would then step in with a series of prompts. They went as followed: please continue. If the teacher still hesitated, the experiment requires you to continue. If the teacher still hesitated, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And if they still hesitated, you have no other choice but to continue. If you thought that the procedure for this experiment was at all disturbing, then the results might make you even more disturbed. 18 different variations were performed, and they all yielded similar results. Over 65% of participants administered the maximum voltage of 450 volts, and all of them administered 300 volts. In his article, Understanding Behavior in the Milgram Obedience Experiment, Thomas Blass notes that many of the participants were willing to punish another human being simply because an experimenter told them to do so, and that experimenter or authority figure didn't have any real coercive powers of enforcement. Basically, the experimenter had no tools to enforce the commands, but the teacher still continued with the experiment. If you're wondering how this is possible, Milgram has a conclusion. We each have two states of mind. The autonomous, in which a person chooses their own actions and takes responsibility for those actions. And the agentic, in which a person is given instructions by someone else and carries out those actions, but then passes off responsibility to the person giving the orders. So in effect, Milgram showed that we are ingrained with a certain level of obedience from the time that we're young till we're adults. That's instilled in us. If you're sitting there thinking that you would never commit the types of acts that were committed by Nazis, you're probably right in most instances. But we never really know what we're capable of doing until we're actually put in that situation. That was Milgram's main point, that the situations that we're in are the biggest factors for determining our actions. And if you still think that there's no way you could ever commit some kind of atrocities, then I would like to just leave you with this. Even Abraham murdered his son at God's request. Thank you very much.